So welcome everyone. I am Karen Gimnig. I am the Associate Director of the Cohousing Association of the U.S. Karin Hoskin, who's our Executive Director, is also with us tonight, waving hello. And I just want to say welcome on behalf of the association. This is a web chats or something that we are sponsoring as an association, as a service to the community. And if you are interested in offering some financial support to support this and the other programs that we do, we certainly appreciate that, and you can do that at cohousing.org. And I'll put a link in that to the chat in a moment if you'd like to do that. A couple of notes about Zoom as we start off tonight. If you can keep yourself muted when you're not actually talking, which will be most of the time, that helps us keep the overall noise down so we can all hear our speaker. And if you haven't used the chat before, if you move your cursor down to the bottom of your screen, you'll get a menu there that has a chat option. And that's where we'll be looking for questions that we'll answer after the initial part of Ted's presentation tonight. So that's sort of the instructions around Zoom. Our plan for this evening is we are recording, so if you don't wish to be on the recording, you're welcome to turn off your video and keep yourself muted. But the recording will be posted to YouTube and through our website and so on so that people can watch it after tonight. We've had lots of requests for that and lots of people watching them after the fact, so that's exciting. What else do I need to say? I think that's it for announcements. So I just want to welcome everyone and particularly welcome Ted Rau. He is with Sociocracy For All. And I think one of the most exciting things recently to know is that he and Jerry Koch-Gonzalez have authored a book called Many Voices, One Song about sociocracy that can be found through their website. And so I think that's all we need by way of introduction. And Ted, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much, Karen. I was thinking about doing some very trite joke about keeping it super brief today, because that's what we're going to be talking about short. I will, of course, try and keep it short, but there are surprisingly many things to say about short meetings. So I will dive in as people are still coming in, and then there's some time for questions. That's the standard format as far as I understand for this. So let me do that. Play from start. Keeping meetings short or shorter. It says here my name and my contact info. And also the website of Sociocracy For All is surprisingly sociocracyforall.org, so we should be very easy to find. The first question I want to answer very briefly is why is this a topic that jumped to my mind when we were asked whether we would be interested in offering a talk like this. And the why for me in the context of cohousing are two things. One is meetings are a chance to connect and learn about each other, you know. So in the community, there are many different places to connect, but meetings are one of them. And often it is a very precious time where many people come together. We want to spend that time well. And the more friction there is, the more it takes away from connection. So for me, I always want to bring connection wherever people meet. That is also in meetings, among other things, and I want to make that time enjoyable. And the other thing is something that is easy to miss, and that is if meetings are long and ineffective, people resent it, might not show up anymore, or might sit there breeding resentment, which clearly impacts how they can show up, which might cause the group losing their voice, at least their voice at their best. So having long meetings takes away inclusiveness, if you think of it that way, because people who just can't stand long meetings will simply stop turning up. Then the other question is, so how? There are many aspects that go into the length of meetings. I'm going to focus on three. One is the group size. I want to show people some ways of how to keep group small so that meetings can be faster. One other thing is creating clarity. I will talk more about that. And then consent decision-making as a decision-making method that is a little bit more pragmatic, I would say, while still being inclusive and than what groups often do. So I'm going to talk about each of them one by one, and then we'll wrap it up. So when I say empower small groups, I also say explicitly avoid large groups. And I mean that in the meeting context. Of course, there's nothing wrong with meeting in a large group and doing something connecting, educational, whatever. There's nothing wrong with large groups as long as we're not trying to get through an agenda that is around decisions. And those of you who are familiar with sociocracy will have recognized right away from the fact that I'm part of Sociocracy For All, that the tools that I am presenting here are tools that are standard in sociocracy. But I'm also aware that not every group here will run sociocratically, even in the near future, and that's not even an expectation I have. So I'm trying to share everything on a generic level that I think groups can take and just use as individual tools. So when I mean empower small groups, there's sort of the full-on version, and then there is the a little watered down version of it. In sociocracy, we actually, in dynamic governance, which is the same thing as sociocracy, we distribute authority into circles. So, for example, you could have those 4 teams and they actually have power and authority to do things without having to check back with the whole group. And that is a fine detail that sometimes people miss. So if you, for example, have a gardening circle here, that gardening circle, this team makes all the decisions about gardening that they have been given. And you can also just do it partially. In this case, you would only give some, like little pieces of cake, so to speak, of authority to those groups. In general, we try to drive decision-making to the most, sort of to the outskirts here. Those circles can form sub-circles and so on. The circle in the center in a sociocratic circle structure is only for flow of information. Why does that help smaller, shorter meetings? For the simple reason that there's fewer people in the room. And if there's fewer people in the room, everybody can be heard better who is actually present. And in a system like this, where we know where everything has its place and we know where everything is, it is safe to have small groups, because through a system of information flow and transparency, like public minutes and so on, and feedback mechanisms, it is still true that everybody's voice can be heard, but for the decision-making meeting, only some people will be present. And when I say small group, typically a group size of 5 to 7 people works well. I'm actually a fan of even 4 to 5 people, but that depends. Okay, so a meeting with 5 people will be shorter than a meeting with 50 people while getting through more agenda items. And I'm aware that in co-housing context, groups sometimes shy away from that, of actually passing on power. And the reason, the way it sometimes works is if we do little campaigns of experiments. For example, we have a given project, and instead of bringing it back to the whole group, we send it to a small group and tell them exactly what the parameters are under which they can make a decision. So we don't just have to give away everything without any say in it, but we can do little packaged forms of this. All right, the second thing is, and this is the piece that I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation, is agenda planning. How that creates clarity, and clarity makes meeting shorter and also less frustrating, because you know what's happening, why it's happening, where it's going. And the same length, like the same 1.5 hour meeting can feel very different if you always are aware of what you're doing right now and you're intentional about it, compared to a meeting where for 1.5 hours you don't actually even know what you're doing. So it's not only the time that is relevant, it is also how we spend that time. So here you see a typical meeting format, the way I would plan a meeting. I'm aware that this is not completely standard, and I'm also aware that I want to focus on one aspect of it. So I will just very briefly talk about it. Check in, and at the end I will show you a link that has goes to a whole article online that explains the whole agenda that we use, or the meeting format. So there will be a place to read up on it. We start every meeting with a check-in. We end every meeting with a checkout or meeting evaluation. We have this admin time where we just make sure everybody's there. We know who's not there. We know who's subbing for them, who's taking minutes if the note taker isn't there, and so on. Announcement, all of that stuff. We consent to the agenda in a meeting because we want the whole group to take responsibility for the agenda. Because if we all consent to a certain agenda item taking 15 minutes and somebody goes away over time, it is on the whole group to call attention to that and be intentional about how we spend our time. Okay. There are here in the box, these are the agenda items that this group would be talking about. And these are just random, fairly random agenda items that could show up on the agenda in my cohousing community in Pioneer Valley, where I'm part of Community Life Circle. That's the circle that deals with all the interpersonal things, everything that has to do with people, really, instead of animals, gardens, or buildings. So there are, and this is something I want to advocate for, there are 3 different agenda item sort of species. One is reports, one is an exploration that people do together, and one is a decision. And my point in this piece of the presentation is that if you have clarity over what it is that you're doing right now, whether it's a report, an exploration, or a decision, when you have clarity about that, it will help significantly orienting the group in that agenda item and being more to the point. And I will have some examples for that. So here we could, for example, have a report where somebody met with the membership team and is now reporting back what was said. Somebody could be having an idea about offsite members, and now the circle is asked to respond to that, and they might generate some ideas. Or there could be a proposal that has been floating for a while around signage. That's something we argue about here. How many signs do we have, political signs, and so on. And we could be asking to make a policy decision on that. Okay, what I always want from a complete agenda is having the timing information. So we have the topic, the time, and the kind of agenda item it is. Like, what do you want with that agenda item? Where do you want to go with that? Do you just want us to know? Do you want a decision to be made? And so on. So here you see those 3. Okay, we already talked about that. So what's the difference between those 3? And this is how I think about it. So report is really a one-way thing, and that is somebody has information and shares it with the group. And the goal is simply that everybody in the group understand. If you had the task of organizing an event and you want to make sure everybody knows how that went, you report on it. Nothing further is to do about it, you just transmit information. That's easy. Here's the reason why I like just making sure that everybody understands that, because if somebody is just reporting on it and there is no exploration needed, then we don't need to talk about what people's opinions are. It is totally fine to just report and say, thank you. Does everybody understand what has been reported? And then you're done. You don't have to discuss the why and what could have done instead, or and so on. That's not the point when it's a report. When it's a report, you only make sure everybody understands. You can, of course, ask questions, whatever it takes so people understand, but you don't go into the why and what if. Then the next step is exploration. And in order to explore anything, you first have to understand what you already know. So for example, if Jody brings what was my example? Brim has an idea about offsite members, First, we have to understand what Jody said, and then we respond in that order. It really helps to understand what you're responding to first before you respond to it. That's also another thing. I not only advocate for those different steps, but also for the steps in that order. And often we jump to opinions when really first it is time to just ask questions until we understand. So we understand first and then we explore. And sometimes that's all it takes, because let's say Jody is in the room, she hears the feedback and we're good. Nothing needs to happen from that. There's no decision needed. We don't need to vote. Nothing happens except for the input has been given from the group back. The third category is decision making. So now we have a three-way thing. So this was one way because it was just transmitting information. Here there was transmitting information and feedback coming back, or input. And now we have information being transmitted, and then feedback is shared, and then a decision is made. And again, we build these on each other. So for example, if somebody brings a proposal, like in my example, it was a proposal on climate, the first step is for everybody to understand the proposal, to give their reactions, and then see whether they can consent to it. I'll say more about that. But first, I want to show you how that affects meeting planning. So here's how I look at it. In every meeting, we always try to move everything, all our topics, as far as we need them to on this what do we call it, arrow here. So if it's just to understand, like to report something, great, then we stop here. When we want to generate feedback, we go over there. And if we decide, we go over there. And if we already know we have to head on a decision on something, then we go through all those steps on the way. But it doesn't all have to happen during the same meeting. For example, if we have topic A and we go through understand, explore, decide, that could actually happen in different meetings. In one meeting, we could only invite, for example, invite somebody and tell us, okay, tell us about your proposal. In the next meeting, we only gather responses and make sense of what was said and how we look at it. And then we could make a decision in the next meeting. It doesn't all have to happen in the same meeting. This could also be spread out even longer over time. You know, maybe you have some other crisis in this meeting, so you don't get around to it. The important thing is that you always know where you are in the process, so where you are on that arrow. And if you have shared vocabulary in your group, then you can more easily refer to it. Of course, you can spread some out and make them longer or shorter. It doesn't really matter how long or short they are, as long as you know where you are in the process. And then there's another little variation. There are such things as reviews. So you can make a policy decision here and review it again. You would look at it, make sure you understand it, do your reactions to it, make a new decision and approve it again if that's what you're doing. Here's what I don't like seeing. And that is when everything happens at the same time. Some people are ready to make a decision and some haven't understood the proposal yet. Or we're already trying to head towards a decision, but some people still have new ideas. Okay. When groups are so out of sync, typically all of those groups that get frustrated. And that's what we want to avoid. We want to move together as a group, and then it really helps to have these more fine-grained steps and the shared vocabulary to tell each other where we think we are, or whether we completed those. Another pattern that I'm not a big fan of is this one, where a group understands an issue, makes policy, it just makes a decision, takes a long time with that, and then basically next meeting starts over and doesn't make any progress because the group constantly undoes their decisions. That's extremely frustrating to everybody. So it's another pattern that needs to be avoided. And by the way, the difference between this pattern that I just showed and this is, first of all, the level of intentionality, that they will decide here when to review it again, and also that just some more time has passed in between. So this is very often the case if the decision-making group changes. For example, let's say the 10 people that make this decision are not the same people that make this decision. You have 5 people leaving, 5 new people coming, and the decision is just opened up again and made again. And it's very draining for the group spirit of working teams. The last thing is something like this, where you're aiming towards a decision, but since you don't really know how to move forward, you just stay in this state forever and ever and ever, and nothing really moves forward. All of those patterns are very frustrating, which is what I want to avoid, because I want meetings to be connecting and productive. So, okay. We're already on the third topic here, consent decision making. And many of you might be familiar with that, and note that it's consent and not consensus, though I'll say a few words about that. So in dynamic governance, or in meetings that I'm a part of in general, we don't vote, and we also don't wait until everybody agrees. We use consent decision making, and I'm going to explain here what that is. So first, the way we explain it is there's always something that I want. If you ask me what I want, I will have an answer to that. Okay, I know what I want around signage, for example. I personally, that's me speaking, Ted, I would ban all signs. I don't want any political signs in my community. That's my personal opinion. It's not a policy, but that's if I got what I wanted, that's what I would want. I find them ugly and annoying. But my community made the decision, actually in my circle with me present, that there could be signs. And I consented to that because I can live with it. So this is my preference. This is what we call the range of tolerance. This is what I can live with. And everything outside of that is where I say, no, we can't possibly have a community with those signages. If I could argue, that's what I would say, then I would put my foot down and say, no, this is no way we can do that. So in our jargon here, we call this consent, and this we call an objection. The important thing is that consent includes everything that we don't object to. Let me say that again, because I know that's abstract. Consent includes everything that we don't object to. So if you, for example, don't care enough about the whole issue, then you're not objecting. You're consenting because there's no objection you're making. I've consented to things that I simply didn't care about because it wasn't important to me. And that's totally fine. The consent decision-making really looks at objections, and then of course tries to integrate the wisdom that was shared in the objection and tries to find something that everybody can live with. Okay, that said, the good thing about consent decision-making is that we're not talking until everybody's in this space, in the that's what I want space. And we don't even have to start the conversation thinking that we have to convince everybody, because we don't. The only thing we have to make sure is that nothing that really is really keeps somebody from participating, that we catch that and we deal with that. We're not spending all that much time on the yes, it could also be done better kind of space. The consent process. So hold on, it's sort of obvious to me, but it might not be obvious to you. Why does this make meetings shorter? And for the simple reason that we can cut down on the finding the perfect proposal aspect of meetings, because we're not looking for perfect. We're only looking for something that is good enough. Okay. So often in meetings that I facilitate, and also others in my community, that's not just me, that's the way we do things. When there's a lot of discussion, we could do this, we could do that. Somebody just somebody just make a proposal, and if that proposal is good enough, then the decision can be made and we can move forward. Because anything can be tweaked and made better, but then it's sort of the better done than perfect kind of approach for decision making. We are very clear about our consent process, though, and that also, although it looks tedious, helps speed up meetings. I'll show you that. So you already know the framing of understand, explore, decide. That's what I talked about earlier, just that now I put them in a horizontal line, but it's the same thing. If I have a proposal, or let's say somebody brings a proposal, let's say I bring a proposal to ban all the political science in the community. First step is make sure everybody understands the proposal. What do you mean all political science? What do you define political? Do you mean really everywhere in the community? How about inside, you know, visible from the outside in our windows? Okay, all those questions that could come up. I can already hear them actually, because we've had this discussion so often. Okay, so I would present my proposal and people would ask questions. I would answer them until they understand my proposal or a group's proposal. And then people would do a quick reaction round, or a reaction round in general. Everybody would respond to that proposal. They would say things like, I'm really not sure, I really want to, you know, support the person, my friend who wants to run for school council. And it's important for me to show my support when there's elections. So I do want to put that sign up, or something like that. Okay, then we hear each other. That's good. And then in the consent process, we make sure there are no objections. The good thing about, again, splitting it up into first step, understand, second step, explore, third step, decide, is that we avoid all the issues around that very moment of decision making that I see so often. First issue that often comes up is some people already give opinions, some people haven't understood the proposal yet. I've mentioned that already. Then there is also everybody says something, but then we're not sure whether we've now actually made a decision or not. Some people walk away from the same meeting thinking that we made a decision. Some people think we only explored. Okay, to avoid that lack of clarity, it is useful, even when everybody seems on the same page, to just ask, okay, so did everybody consent to this? Was there any objection? Okay, no objections. Okay, we have consent on that. Just to acknowledge that. That takes 20 seconds. And you don't have to talk about next time whether you made a decision or not, because that's also a very frustrating conversation to have. Let's see, do I have anything else on this? Yeah, another thing is that this is actually a very precious phase where we hear everybody's reactions. They might not rise to the level of an objection. So people might end up saying, like, for instance, myself, about the signages, that I really didn't like them, but I ended up consenting to there being signs. Or in the example that I used about banning signs, somebody might really want to support their friend running for school council, but might be willing to ban signs. So all of that can happen, but in the exploration phase, we learn about each other's needs around that. And that's important to do, because this is not just a one-time decision. This is a group that has history and wants to, with each other, and builds that history and trust. So this is useful to do. All right. I've already mentioned this, but here's the visual for that. And then I think we're basically done. I am a big advocate of experimentation where it seems safe in groups. And it really helps if groups step out of the, let's find the perfect decision, the right thing to do, and holding it a little bit more lightly and thinking about, well, what is good enough so we can move forward, kind of approach. And the frame that we're holding is more like this. So we have an idea, we make a proposal, we try it out, we evaluate. We learn something, we start over, okay? So the first time we're having this discussion about signage, we already know that we will evaluate, and that we will try it out, evaluate, and then review our policy. So when we have this discussion, we don't have to discuss it and be all that it doesn't have to be as heated of a discussion if we know we will revise it anyway. So everybody knows over time, I will be heard, it will be fine. We can try it out and see what actually happens. And then we do that all over and over and over again. adjusting to whatever happens in our community. All right, that marks the end. I'm going to briefly say where you can learn more. Those of you who know us already know all those things though. So we have a study group curriculum for groups who want to learn together. These are 6 videos that you can watch together and pause and do exercises. There is our book that Karen already mentioned. We have an online immersion training that is, I think, our most favorite training. And there are 2 articles here that are on today's topic. The meeting format, that's the article I promised earlier. And then actually maybe a somewhat summary, or maybe it even goes a little beyond of what I said, an article on Medium. And all those things that I just mentioned, I'm happy to send you in an email, those links, if you want to put your email address in the chat. I'm happy to do that. Do I give it to you now, Karen? Or what do I do?
Yeah, so that what we do next is take questions. So thank you for all that great information. And so far we don't have questions in the chat, but I'm betting they will appear. The other thing you might do is just put those links. I see you're already putting the slides in the chat, so that's great. And we're getting a number of email addresses of people who'd like those resources. So we'll capture those at the end. So who has questions?
I see Mukunda here.
I see them too, yeah. You apparently were very thorough in your presentation. Everyone's satisfied.
Mukunda, were you waving or did you want to say something?
I'd like to ask a question if I can.
Sure.
Could you tell us, it says sometimes this sociocracy is sometimes described as decisions by a few, but input by many. And you've described that, but could you tell us some of the typical methods to gather input so that the many that will be impacted by the decisions still have a voice when those few make that decision?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. There's a slogan that I really like, and that is, some people hold the frame of 1 member, 1 vote, and we turn it here into 1 member, 1 voice.
Mm.
And I really like that because you might not be a member of the community life circle that is making the decisions about signage, but that doesn't mean that you can't be heard. And so what are those methods so that you can be heard? Let's see, for co-housing context, what are the methods and the systems that we use? One is that we still have all member meetings, not to make decisions, but to gather input. So for example, on a Saturday morning, when other co-housing communities might have their general meeting, we will have what we call a full circle meeting. And for example, membership circle could ask for input on a policy. And those who've seen the policy and want to give input to it, they can come to that salon kind of format. The other thing, of course, is good old email. If you know each other well in a community, you also sort of know who might be good to ask. For example, if you talk about pets, obviously you would talk. If you talk about dogs, you might want to talk to everybody in the community who has a dog or has had a dog, or people who you know have issues with dogs. So there's not only the asking everybody and hoping people respond, but also the responsibility of the circle to go solicit input from people who they know are basically like stakeholders in that decision. Let's see, what are other ways of doing it? Surveys, yes, all of those. You can also ask other circles, of course. You can ask your parent circle, you can ask your sibling circle. There's really no limit to how many people you can ask. And just to emphasize that more, what Mukunda said already, there is the difference of small groups that really, in my mind, having small decision-making groups that know each other well and work well together, frees up, like liberates us enough so we can solicit, like hear more input. Because hearing the input doesn't mean that it has to be an hour-long meetings where people talk over each other, but instead we can really go and just harvest that input so that we get it without all the stuff in between. So it is easier to hear more people as a small group. And I know it sounds ironic at first, you know, it's counterintuitive, but it really works well because everything is calmed down quite a bit. Is that enough, Mukunda?
Beautiful, beautiful, Ted. Thank you.
So Ted, I'm happy to read out questions to you if that helps. So I think you were just answering this one to some extent, but if you make decisions in smaller groups, how do you keep the plenary interested and involved?
You know, it's interesting. I'm laughing about the interested because I'm wondering about that too, actually myself. Because so involved, I think I've already explained how we can hear the voices, right? How do you keep the plenary interested and involved? Well, they all have skin in the game to some extent, right? So they should naturally be involved. Of course, pleasant meetings, pleasant and short and effective meetings are a way to keep people engaged. Another thing outside of good food and snacks is, that always works, is what we do in our whole group meetings is we have a mix of giving input or, you know, working out something together and training and connection time. So we will be in small groups and tell each other about, for example, what we did fairly recently, tell each other about our favorite places, our favorite spots within the community, okay? So, and that is something that people are naturally drawn to because most people move into cohousing because they're interested in their neighbors and in connection time. So having a good mix of working something out together, receiving information in form of training, and having the connection time creates a mix that really works well for people, I would say. One little footnote to sort of full disclosure is that I do have some questions sometimes. In my community, things on the governance end work extremely smoothly. If you remember when I showed the circle diagram, sort of sketchy circle diagram, there's the circle in the middle that is for flow of information between all the circles. And I'm part of that circle in my community. And sometimes we run out of things to do because everything is so well taken care of. And that is actually, it's good news and bad news at the same time, because sometimes I wonder, how will people even hear about things? And then people stop showing up because they just trust that things are just taken care of. It's not, the anxiety level has dropped so far that that sometimes I wonder whether people would even notice if there was a problem because they're so used to everything going so smoothly. So, you know, I mean, it's sort of a good news, bad news things, but we're watching that and we're thinking about it. So I guess that's good news overall.
Great. So the next question was, what do you do when many members of the plenary don't like the decision?
Well, there will be decisions where that will be the case. I have one example that I'm sure that many people here are familiar with, and that is outdoor cats, where many people didn't like the decision that we made because we realized that there are many people in the community who would like to have no limits on outdoor cats, and many people in the community who would like to get rid of all outdoor cats. There was not a lot of common ground in between. So we ended up making a decision that was a very arbitrary compromise of like, whatever, let's just have 6 outdoor cats. It was completely arbitrary, and we were very transparent about that, of like, you're not gonna like this, but that's middle ground. You know, it was really a compromise, and typically compromises I'm not a big fan of because that can create a lose-lose, almost like in this case. But then again, you know, a decision needed to be made, and there was enough sort of heartache around it that it got to a point where just making any decision was actually useful. So we said all those things, you know, we did one of our salons where the circle presented to sort of an all-member kind of group. this is what we're seeing. We don't know how else to solve it. We'll just make an arbitrary decision now. Give us input if you have any better ideas. There weren't all that many better ideas. There were a few things that we hadn't considered, so that it was good to get the feedback. But in the end, we just went with an arbitrary number. But since our process had been so clean and proactive and transparent, I'm sure if you would ask, many people would say, I didn't like it, but it was necessary to just do it. So there's a lot of trust that can be built, not so much on the content of the decision, but just about the process of the decision. If your process is clean, people are much more forgiving because they know they have been heard and they understand why you made a decision. And that's a huge difference. So what do you do if people don't like it? And if you have a very divided kind of split decision context, you put your energy into clean process. That's what I would do.
Okay. Someone said they arrived late and wanted some clarity on the distinction between the understand phase and the next phase, which they thought might be rounds. In the understand phase, are people inputting their opinions about the proposal, or are they holding their opinions until the rounds?
All right, yeah, I knew that would catch up with me, the round thing. So you might be familiar that in Sociocracy, we often, dynamic governance, whatever you call it, we often use rounds. And for example, if people give a reaction, we would do that in a round. Everybody speaks one by one. Same for consent round, each one person says whether they consent or object, so that we have an orderly fashion where we hear everybody's voice. Often that is also done for questions. What I do, that's sort of, for me, that is debatable. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't, kind of thing, because for questions, I don't hold the egalitarian frame as much. So it depends a little. So for me, the reason I'm saying that is because there's a difference between what phase are we in? Are we trying to understand, explore, or decide? And what's our format? Do we just call on people one by one? Do we do a round or whatever? Okay, so that's two different things. It tends to be that the understand phase, the understand phase is, yes, people ask questions until they understand the proposal. And I like giving people sort of the fill in the blank phrases, like, in order to understand the proposal, I need to know, ... And that way you rule out opinions, suggestive questions. People still are able to put in that, but it's really heavily discouraged by that fill in the blank kind of statement. And sometimes I will call around for that. Sometimes I'll just have people popcorn questions. Then the next phase is where people voice their opinions. And that I really, really heavily prefer rounds, because you might have the silent person sitting there who would not speak up that have something brilliant to say. So you might miss out on great information if you don't do a round. So reactions I would always do in a round, and then the consent round is a round. So I guess on the round topic, it doesn't have to necessarily happen for clarifying questions. What I'm very firm about is the different phases: understand phase, explore phase, decide phase, because they require very different frames that we hold. Do I just access information, or do I voice my own opinion? That's very different things. Okay.
Okay. So in the case of the political science question where you live, could you explain how the consent round played out for that? It would be a helpful example.
Yeah, it is a, for example, right? And yet I don't remember. As far as I remember, our policy currently is, correct me if I'm wrong, that you can have political science if it's clearly associated with your house. So you have to, move it close enough to your house that it's not to the path, so that it's clear that it's your opinion, not the community opinion. I still find them ugly, as I think I've made that clear, right? So I guess, Alexandria, I would like to hear what it is about that example that you would like to be fledged out a little, because I don't quite know what.
Sure. No, I guess I wondered how. Can you hear me?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yes, I can.
So I guess I wondered, when you it's not what you wanted, but you could live with it, right? I mean, people went around in the consent round, or when did you guys come up with a compromise that was, well, we'll put them close to the house. And then you went around for consent and people said, I can live with it, I can live with it. And everyone, that's sort of what I was wondering.
Yes, okay, so what I hear, okay, so proposals in general, where do proposals come from? There's two different ways of having it. One is somebody just writes it, okay. Sometimes that's the case when you have a lot of expertise on one person, or it's somebody's role to take care of whatever parking, and then they make the parking policy. They bring it as a proposal. The other option is to write them together collaboratively. In that case, I'm sure we wrote it together because I'm pretty sure we wrote it from scratch. And then, so the way we do that is that we sort of do a checklist of what kind of things we have to cover. And then everybody one by one in a round says a proposal piece, and then we synthesize that, and that is our proposal. And then we would go again through the classic process of, okay, this is the proposal, any questions? What are your reactions? And then we might, for example, if somebody says, I really don't, like, let's say the proposal is everybody can have political science. Okay, somebody might object and say, I really don't want to be associated with a school council candidate of my next door neighbor. I really don't want to. And that would be the objection of like, no, I cannot live with this. This is intolerable. Okay. And then how can we deal with the objection? We would then do a round on the objection, ideas for the objection. And then somebody could come up with the idea of, okay, let's just make it, make sure that it's closely associated to a house. And then that is the motivated proposal. And then we do another consent round, and then that would go through. So that's sort of the role play kind of scenario.
Okay. Thank you. That helps.
Okay.
You're in charge there, Karen.
Yeah. Any other questions? And we are, I think we've covered what's in the chat. So if you have one, feel free to unmute yourself and just speak if you'd like.
There was one that just got added here. How can you explain how the small groups participate in the context of the political science discussion? I guess I need more context. Maybe I understand it good enough. Correct me if not, Vicky. And that is, so in my community, we actually have sort of that, what I call, and I didn't call it that, but the most extreme version of distributed authority. So we actually have a circle, community life circle, that can just make policy around political science. It is within the domain of that circle to make those decisions. So the community at some point decided about all the different topics and issues, which circle they would go into, which people are in that circle, and then people can just go run with it. For example, the Common House circle can just make decisions about the Common House. The Garden circle can just make decisions about the garden. Okay, so that's one important thing to understand. We've let go of the everybody has a say on everything principle. And we chose to do it for good reasons, I find. So when I say the question of, can you explain how the small groups participate in the context of that discussion, is they don't only participate, they run that discussion. Community life, that circle, has full authority to make that decision. Of course, you wouldn't make a decision that gets you a whole, that creates a lot of tension within the community. You work with the community to come to a good result, but you ultimately have the responsibility and the authority to do that. So I see the chat, I'll deal with it later. And then, so in this case, we were authorized to make the decision, but we made sure that we got a lot of feedback. To me, having a lot of power in one small circle always comes with a lot of responsibility. And the responsibility is to take in information and feedback and to solicit that information. We don't just sit back and wait and say, well, you could have told us. You actually go out and ask. That's how you make a good decision. And that behavior of lots of power in groups and lots of responsibility and proactiveness, and as I said earlier, transparency, that builds the trust.
So I'm seeing a raised hand from Scott. Do you want to unmute and go ahead and?
Yeah. So I just had a question. When we often have people in our communities that they sort of process information differently, some faster, some slower, that kind of thing. And we have people, can you hear me?
Yes.
We have people that have an objection to something, but they're not quite sure why. There's just something that doesn't work for them. Or sometimes they have an objection, but they don't want to say it directly, so they bring up something else. You know, we all have ways of
Yeah. No, I'm laughing. Yes, I'm not doubting at all what you're saying.
So I'm wondering how sociocracy itself helps in that process, or do you have other means of supporting people to get clarity or to provide clarity in their objections?
One thing I want to say as a preamble is that sometimes there's a discussion on who owns an objection. Is it the objector or something like whose objection is it? You know, like and in my view, any objection that is raised, hold on, somebody needs to be muted here. Yeah. Any objection that is raised, the moment it's been said, is owned by the whole circle. And the reason I say that is because in my sort of mindset, an objection is something that we can all get behind. So an objection flags something where a need might not be met. And since we all share the same needs with different priorities, maybe, we can all relate to any objection that is raised. Okay. For example, if we had a discussion of another one of those discussions, children and bicycle helmets. Yes, children need bicycle helmets when they ride their bikes in the community. Do they also need a bicycle helmet on a tricycle? How about scooters? How about a 1.5-year-old on a tricycle? Seriously, do they need a helmet when they get on and off and on and off? Okay, that kind of discussion. Okay, so I'm very familiar with that discussion because we've had it so much. And it is a discussion that is worth having. So if now somebody objects, which was the case, I think I was pushing for like, can we not do bicycle helmets on tricycles? Because to me, that's just a rule that will be broken anyway, because it's unrealistic, okay? Somebody was then pushing for safety, okay? Although that objection is not something I raised, I understand safety. Safety is a universal need that I understand. I can relate to that, okay? It's not my objection, but the whole circle can relate to the objection. Okay, so the objection is held by everybody. It is just one person that happens to be the person to raise it. Okay, so it's not a personal thing. And it really isn't. I'm not just trying to sugarcoat it. It really is not a personal thing. So hold on, how did we get here? So people who might not want to raise an objection, or who don't say it clearly, or who are sitting there with some intuition, but they can't really nail it. How do we hear them? And then as soon as somebody just sits there, I mean, I have a very low threshold. Just if somebody says, I object, I would already say, no, hold on, what's under that? You know, like, can we unpack that? Can we help you find out? What is it? I want you to wholeheartedly say, yes, consent. If that's not the case, I want to hear what's happening. So then the person would give us whatever information they have. They don't have to give us the perfect statement of how it relates to the aim of the organization, how it interferes, and why it's an objection. They just tell us whatever they've got. And then we as a circle try to make sense of it. And for example, to me, with the background I have, but I know there's other tools that work too, it really helps to unpack what needs are under that, okay? To really like, is it about safety? Is it about flexibility? Is it about like, what is it for you, okay? And that way we can go to the level of seeing what's really going on. And by the way, I've also experienced it once, which I found really educational and funny in a way, that somebody had sort of this like, something in that is not sitting well, but I don't know what kind of feeling. And then the circle started digging and uncovering what was happening. And in that process, the person had originally objected, was feeling heard so well that they decided to drop their objection. However, the rest of the circle was like, no, we actually really understand your objection now. No, that's not dealt with. So, you know, ownership of objections can also actually shift. And that was a really sweet example of that, of us really getting where that person was coming from. And we were very grateful that that person had raised that. So how did I get to you? Hold on, what am I really trying to answer? So people who process information differently, the who has to take care of that? And the answer is a classic, both. The circle in helping uncover, the objector in giving as to their best knowledge what is going on for them. And then the circle will figure out how to go from there. And that requires skill, of course. Yes, skill is important. And you might also, for example, just you might dig deeper in the group during the meeting, or you might decide that you can't make a decision because somebody really needs to sit on it, and that's okay.
Thank you. That was helpful very much.
Okay. I think we are very near the end of our time, and I think we're out of questions. So this is probably a, oh, Mukunda's raising a hand. Go ahead.
Yeah. Ed, thank you, Karen. I haven't heard you talking about the place of good facilitation to keep meetings short. Can you help a little bit? Because everything you mentioned is in the meetings is going to be handled by the facilitator. So maybe the place of good facilitation to keep meetings short?
It's one and situations, and that is, to quote Jerry, my colleague Jerry, sociocracy not only needs good facilitators, it also needs good followers. To me, a meeting is good when in an extreme case, to say it in an extreme form, the facilitator could drop dead at any given moment and anybody in the circle could continue the meeting. That's a good meeting to me, because everybody completely understands what we're doing, why we're doing it, in what order, and where we are right now. And we could just continue. The only reason we need a facilitator is to sort of, you know, give the next impulse. That's all the facilitator is doing. Let's see. There is, yes, so good facilitation ideally wouldn't even be necessary because anybody could do it. However, that is typically not the case. And then, yes, of course, you do need a lot of skill to do it. However, if you have a facilitator who has to work hard because people offer opinions during question times or still ask questions during, you know, whatever time, people who don't object because they don't understand how to object and so on, then the best facilitator is not going to help you. So, or it would be really hard work and it would still be frustrating. So what I'm advocating for is, yes, good facilitators, but also really well-trained groups. That's, I think, I might change my mind on that, but that is what's coming to me right this moment. Really, the whole thing only works if the whole group moves, you know, like those, it's a little trite, I don't know, maybe you're not all that much in the self-management world as I am, but there's the imagery that people really like of like a flock of birds or a school of fish, how they're moving swiftly together and seem to just intuitively know where the others are going. That's what we want to create in a group. And that only works if we all play by the same rule set.
Okay. Are you good with that one?
I'm good with that one. I'm wondering what Mukunda is writing, but I'm
No. It's just because I started writing the question and then I decided to speak it. So forget about.
Oh, I see. Got it. And how do I define short? 1.5 hours is my attention span.
Okay.
So I'm good for another half hour, that means. Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's close out this hour, and then if Ted wants to go on for another half hour, I won't stop him. But thanks to everyone for coming. Thanks, Ted, for lots of great information. And I see you've put some links for us in the chat, and we'll also get those up on the website with the recording of the video when we get that up. Typically within a day or two, we can get that video processed and up, so hopefully by the end of the week. we want to remind you again that this is a service of the Cohousing Association of the US, and although we don't charge for it, there certainly is cost associated with it, so we welcome donations. Upcoming events with Coho US, we're doing something for the very first time we're very excited about on November 26th. So this is Monday, this coming, at 5 p.m. Pacific, 6 p.m. Mountain, 7 Central, 8 Eastern. We will be doing a webinar, and it will be about what the association is up to. And that webinar is one you need to register for. And Karin, if you could paste that link into the chat real quickly so everyone has it. You will need to register for that webinar, but it's open to everybody, and we've got some cool stuff to share, so you'll sort of know what's going on nationally relative to cohousing and in the association. So we're excited about that. The next web chat is December 4th. Alan Ohashi will be sharing with us about facilitation techniques for aggressive behavior intervention. So that will be at 6 Pacific, 9 Eastern. I'll let you do the math on the others, and notices will be going out about that. And I think that's all the announcements I have for tonight. So we will sort of formally close. Thank you, everyone. And Ted, I'll leave it up to you if you want to hang out a while longer or not.
I will.
Thank you. Thank you, Ted.
Are we officially going to release the Karen? We're going to wait till the noise calms down, and then you can. I'm happy to have you, Karen. I'm just aware that you might want to leave.
Oh no, I was hanging out for a few minutes.
Yeah,
I'm good.
It's okay.
I had a question. Would now be an okay time to ask?
Yes.
My question was, you mentioned that a lot of the decisions in the community were made in circles, and you know, they were sort of vested with power from the whole community. So I'm wondering, are there any decisions that are made by the whole community, or are they all sort of made by smaller circles? Thank you.
Really, every group that adopts that kind of decision making or that kind of governance system can tailor it themselves. You know, at the beginning, when you adopt that kind of system, you would write down which circle does what, and you could also define what remains in the whole group. In my community, what is it? It is all decisions that affect the built environment in terms of, for example, tearing down a house, or building a big addition, building an extra house, that kind of stuff. That remains in the large group, and like all member group. Then what else is it? I think our budget. I know that doesn't necessarily have to be the case in all groups, but I know it's being done quite a bit. Though that is fairly easy because the budget is just prepared by each circle. So each circle says what their budget should be for the work that they need. And then we just see whether it matches. And if it doesn't, we talk about it. But it's a very, very easy meeting typically. That might be it. I'm sure I'm forgetting something. Changes in the governance structure would be in the whole group. So that might be it. So that happens, you know, whole group decisions, maybe twice a year, something like that. Very easy. Anything else? How do we 20 people still? We can also do it the other way. Oh, somebody wants to unmute there. Vicky, are you unmuting? Are you on your way to unmuting? I can tell from the, no? Okay. Maybe.
No, we just wanted to thank you.
Okay. Where are you, Vicky?
With the Grey Rock co-housing community in Fort Collins, Colorado. And there's about, well, there was about 10 of us here. So I know Karen would like to know that. We've been watching them as a group for since they began, and they've been incredibly informative.
Cool.
So thank you.
I have a question for him, actually. One
Oh,
of the
there.
challenges that we face in our community is that at this point, we don't have a lot of, let me think how to say this diplomatically. Some of us do not have much trust of other people's ability to make good decisions. And so it's hard to imagine how we would turn over more decision making to smaller circles, because we already are struggling with some lack of trust. So people have to be there at the whole meeting because they don't trust that other people will make good decisions. So I don't know if I really like what you presented, and I can't quite see how we would get from where we are to where you are.
Yes, it does take some work. It's true. Trust, trust is basically the currency in a community. And it's, when you have like, what is that, like inflation, when trust erodes, it's very, very hard to turn that around. Okay, let's see, several things. One, as I already said, about clean process, but we have to, okay, no, let me back up actually. Where does lack of trust come from? All of us come from, we were all socialized in a society where trust is not necessarily being rewarded. Okay, so we all carry some sort of previous experience of where trust was violated. So that, I want to sort of acknowledge that there is a reality to this. So people come with a history and they don't just snap out of that history. Okay, so anything assuming that would be unrealistic, assuming that they would just snap out of it. What really helps, in my view, is having agreed upon process. If it's eroded enough that you can't agree on process, then you're in trouble. I've had a group contact me. I think it was Cohousing, might have been something else, might have been a co-op or something, like not housing. But they said something to the effect of, we want to bring you in for training to help us with our decision making, but we can't seem to make the decision to go hire you. That's, it is funny, and yet it isn't funny at all, because you're so stuck when you're in that position. I was sort of laughing. I'm like, oh God, that's so sad. Anyway, so if you don't trust that, for example, if you proposed to put some time into this, but people don't trust that it's a good idea, then what are you going to do? And I'm aware of all of that. I've seen it enough that I'm aware. Clarity about process yet helps, and you can always define things. For example, you don't have to ask the community to give all their rights away, what they perceive as rights. You could, so to me, the game is about creating sandboxes that are specific enough that people can go play without having to check back. And the sandbox can be very small. Let's see, let me come up with a good example. What is a good example? Hold on, give me a second. I don't know, if you have an event, for example, I don't know if you have one, but we have a community retreat, and the community retreat is planned by a committee of 4 people. And until we show up on Saturday morning, we have no idea what they're even going to do with us. No idea. That requires a lot of trust. Like 60 people just show up because of what 4 people planned as a surprise. And that I actually had a hard time. I noticed myself and like, what makes me so sure that this is even going to be worth it? Anyway, but that is a good and safe, that's a fairly safe area to play of, like, hey, how about we empower these 4 people to make the decision about this one thing that is limited in time, limited in scope, limited in time, limited in budget. It's reversible. Like, give them something easy to play with, see how it goes, and make sure to evaluate how it goes. So remember, we did this experiment 1 month ago. Okay, you could say, for example, we did this experiment. How did that go? We empowered those 4 people. How did that go for you? What would you have wished? Okay, if there's a lot of feedback in terms of what should be different, then do it again, this time considering the feedback, and work your way up there. Okay, so give more often, more groups, more power. so that you can get to that place. But that is a long-term project, especially when you're not starting with a lot of trust in the beginning. Here's one basic thing that I don't have an answer to, in full transparency, and that is again a Jerry quote. He always says, and it's very convincing and somewhat funny. He says, if you ask me, I will have an opinion about everything. So don't ask me. Okay, just go do something. However, and that comes into play with, little expenses like, should the kitchen have 8 or 9 pitchers? Should the kitchen have glass or plastic pitchers? Should we buy another trash bin here? That kind of stuff. Please don't ask me that. Just do it, or don't, or whatever, but don't ask me. However, I have an opinion about everything, so please don't ask me. Just that little thing takes a lot of what I would call maturity. And if you have a significant number of people not in that place that they can just say that, that's hard. And I do not have an answer to that, to be honest. I'm sure Karen would, but I don't have an answer. I know Karen and I have talked about trust.
Is that an invitation?
Yeah, that is an invitation, actually.
Well, thank you, because one of the things that we've had a lack of trust about is we actually got funded last year to have a bunch of facilitation training, but we can't even agree on who to hire as a facilitator. And so it was perfect for us, these webinars, because they're actually giving us a place to start and to come up with some new ideas about trust and where to go from here, because we haven't been able to even figure out how to spend the money we have that's sitting there. There's such a lack of trust. So thank you so much for these webinars.
Karen, before I know, just a little add-on. Sorry, I'm aware that it's your turn. Especially money, because it can be divided up so easily. Vicky, how about you play it safe with just 1/8 of the money, or like, hey, can we empower this group to make a decision on 1/8 of the money? Like, that's very different from power that is sometimes hard to divide up. Money is very easy to divide up, so you can play like. Build little trust packages and see what happens with that. But now I want to hear Karen.
Yeah, I was going to make the same suggestion for that particular decision, that you may be able to look for ways to engage with facilitators on a smaller basis, some remote work with someone that would be less expensive than like a whole weekend, for example, and try them out. So you've got your, your way in that way. In terms of how I approach trust, I definitely think it's something where it's a great place to bring in a facilitator. I think it's hard to do trust building activities within your own group. If you happen to have somebody who's really skilled and is generally trusted by everybody, lucky you, but usually when that stuff comes up, it's tough to do from within. So bringing in someone from outside is very much appropriate in that situation. And my approach to that is I really look at relational pieces. What are the pieces in our culture? What are the stories that we bring with us from our culture and probably from our early childhood, that are feeding the conflicts and the places of distrust? And how can we kind of reframe that and get really conscious within ourselves? What is it in me that makes me less inclined to trust? What are the things I'm concerned about? What are the things I'm afraid of? And the funny thing is, just getting conscious of them, just putting words to them, just sort of recognizing, this is the story I've been telling myself. I have some other choices about the stories I could tell myself. Just that consciousness often shifts trust pretty dramatically, even if nobody else in the community is changing their behavior. So really getting into some of that relational work and just uncovering the ways that we were brought up in our culture to be not trusting and frankly not trustworthy. We were brought up to be competitive. That was very much the culture of our schools for most of us. And getting just clear about that and recognizing some of those things can make a huge difference for a community. So that would be my answer.